This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. Come Carpentier de Gourdon joins me once again. We saw tremendous riots on the streets of Paris the other day after what was merely a football match. The world watched astounded as Paris, one of the most beautiful cities in the world, burned, and there were riots in Paris after this football match. This has been happening in Paris again and again. And Come Carpentier is here to talk to me. He's one of the, perhaps I think of him as the best analyst of India Europe relations, as someone who really understands how the European mind functions and what's going on in Europe to try and help us understand what's really going on in Paris. Come, welcome.
Thank you, Hindol. Nice to see you again, and greetings to all viewers and listeners. Regarding the Paris riot, this is an old story. It's recurrent. Of course, other cities also have experienced major riots, particularly Berlin and London. But Paris has a tradition. It's a naturally rather riotous and rebellious city. So one always expects some sort of unrest there. But the new element, or it's not new, but at least the element that has become predominant in the last 20 years is the foreign immigrant element, which essentially reflects an estrangement between the indigenous population of European origin and the relative newcomers, or sometimes people who have been here for 3 generations. So in other words, people who were born to immigrants who either had come from their native countries or were themselves children of the first generation. So these young people, because most of them are very young, are French, most of them legally. Of course, there are quite a few legal or illegal foreign residents, but the core is on paper French, but they are completely, I would say, estranged and alienated from the mainstream society, and they live as sort of colonies, generally fairly segregated, and their attitude to all the symbols of the state and even the religion of the country tends to be very hostile. They have a mixture of anarchism and in many cases Islamic fundamentalism. It doesn't mean that they really know much about their own religion, but they use it as a weapon to attack and try to bring down symbols of the state. So you have had a number of arson attacks on churches, which are purely motivated by vandalism and by the belief that Christianity is evil because it is not Islam. And you have attacks on the symbols of the French state, which is seen as an oppressor. And of course, the police has often reacted with some violence or some brutality. But then again, the police also is under heavy stress. And even though they are under constant legal watch, which means that if a policeman is accused of having misbehaved and used excessive force, he can lose his career and be severely punished. On the other hand, they are asked to repress serious trouble. And let's face it, the trouble is serious. It involves a lot of vandalism, but also plunder, looting, arson, and physical violence on public and private property. And the French state has tried to minimize it under pressure from human rights lobbies and leftist parties, saying that these are just young people who are sort of venting their frustration and sometimes just wanting to have a good time fighting the police, which is seen as a sort of a heroic sport. But this kind of excuse should not hide the fact that we are dealing with a very dangerous social situation, which could easily erupt into endemic civil warfare. And given that a lot of weapons are illegally in the country, many of them have come from other war theaters, such as Ukraine, because we all know that a lot of weapons delivered to Ukraine by the West are being resold on the black market and end up in the hands of gangs, criminal organizations, and terrorist groups. So obviously some Ukrainians are making money, and so are some of the people who are selling them the weapons. So this becomes a vicious cycle of arms illegal exports across borders.
20 years ago, when I was in film school, I remember watching this film, and I'm sure you know about it, called Lahain or Hate, which was about, these sort of, these areas that you talk about in the outskirts of Paris and other places, which were a bit like the projects in what would be called, community housing or the projects in England, and what really goes on there and the kind of hate that sort of, bubbles up, this lack of integration that you just spoke about. And 20 years later, we're still talking about this. Why has nothing changed?
Well, if anything, it has gotten worse because the causes of the problem have not been addressed. On the contrary, the government has generally been, if not encouraging, at least turning a blind eye to immigration, legal and illegal, in the belief that on the one hand, you need a lot of immigration to make up for the low fertility rates of the native population and to fill some of the more painful job positions that many ethnic French do not want to do. And therefore, you need people who are willing to do the hard jobs, such as collecting the garbage and maintaining the infrastructure and construction. So on that level, you have, of course, a strong appeal for immigration. But on the other hand, you also have the humanitarian tolerance for anything which is regarded as refugee immigration, that if anybody claims he is persecuted somewhere, then he has a right to be in your country and you should help him and support him and not throw him out. So this is a very noble and very commendable principle in theory, but it leads to an unmanageable situation eventually because you are dealing with millions of people and you cannot really investigate in many cases whether they are truly refugee, whether they qualify as refugee, and whether they risk death or very starvation, you might say, in their own countries, because in many cases you cannot find out what the exact situation is. You don't even know very often from what country they come, because many of them don't have passports or have destroyed them. So they claim they are from one country, but they may be from the next country. And in Africa, it's very hard to tell apart because the borders are very porous and symbolic in a way. So at that level, what you have to do is give them the benefit of the doubt and keep them there for years. And technically, they would be in secluded facilities, but you can't really do that. So many of them escape and go into the mainstream. And eventually, you don't know where they are. And they spread around the country. And many of them are under the influence of radical Islamist movements. They are manipulated by the countries that they come from, particularly Algeria, Tunisia, Turkey, Syria, and other countries which have a political interest in using them, such as perhaps I would say Iran or, it's difficult to tell. Every situation is different. But the radical movement that has spawned in the many Muslim states has spread to Europe, and now Europe is in some way held hostage to that.
Seeing it, of course, not just on the streets of Paris, but across Europe, as you were mentioning. But similar things are being seen also in streets of London and Birmingham and Manchester and so on and so forth. And it seems to have come to the streets of many US cities, American cities too, especially with the so called anti Palestinian protest. I'm talking, of course, the most recent incident in Boulder, where Molotov cocktails were thrown. And I cannot imagine Boulder is almost like an idyllic town in the US. That Molotov cocktails are being thrown in Boulder, and of course that terrible incident in Washington D.C. After this this meeting in DC, these two Israeli diplomats, young diplomats who were murdered. This seems to be spreading, Cole.
Yes, of course it is spreading. You see, there is a very old conflict between, generally speaking, you might say Jews and Muslims. And there has also been historically, if not a conflict, at least a very strong mutual suspicion or hostility between many Christians and many Jews. And in the case of today's world order, when you see on the one hand, a growing gap between the so-called developing world and some of the richer, more powerful countries that used to be colonial powers, colonial resentment has combined with a number of other causes, ideological or political. And the Palestine situation has been a detonator, particularly what's happening in Gaza, because now you witness mainstream American companies that are pulling out of Israel, even American companies, which used to be unconditionally sympathetic to Israel. Now they realize that it's creating such a bad image that with what's happening in Gaza, the starvation, the massacre of civilians, etc., etc. So in Boston Consulting Group is the latest that has just pulled out, saying we cannot associate with what's going on there. And you can see a sea change in American society now. A lot of the elites, the wealthy, the privileged are still very much supporting of Israel, although with Trump, you can also see that it's becoming quite ambivalent. You know, there is a lot of sort of, how would I say, double talk about it. But in the American lower and middle class population, hostility to Israel is growing, and it is very prominent, very visible in academic milieus. You see, despite the very strong presence of Jews, many of the Jews are actually leading the anti-Israeli movement. Liberal Jews have become extremely disgusted with what's going on with the Likud party and its extremist, Zionist associates. So naturally, with what's going on there and the hostility in the Middle East and all the different countries involved in it, including the permanent threat of an all-out war between Israel and Iran, it's a fertile ground for people to take the law in their own hands or to join organizations which are fighting for a radical cause, which they believe can be served by violence. And I have seen Boulder, which is traditionally, I used to live there, so it's traditionally a very liberal town. And I'm sure now most people in Boulder are outraged by what's happening in Palestine. And except for those who are Jews or who are, the typical conservative Christian evangelist Americans, the others are almost unanimously against Israel, at least against the current Israeli regime. So this is an explosive mix. And if you look at the relatively extreme positions taken on all sides, you can't expect things to go any better. I mean, in France now, synagogues are under threat. Jews are requesting special protection. And it used to be that many of them were going to Israel to escape what they perceive to be a dangerous environment in France. But then now in Israel, the situation is hardly better. So they are between the devil and the deep sea, if you want to call it that way.
This is of course very frightening for many people around the world. I also want to talk to you a little bit about how Europe is changing, because you and I have had many conversations on global order in the last couple of years, and we have in a sense you have tracked the changes in Europe. Do you think that there is a renewed spirit in Europe to put more money where their mouth is, especially in the defense industry? I read constantly reports about how Germany is trying to revive its defense manufacturing, the same perhaps with Sweden and many others. Do you see a turn back on some of the old ideas of pacifism in Europe after what has happened and what is still happening in the Ukraine war with Russia?
Undoubtedly. But you see, one has to also analyze the phenomenon in terms of class and political ideology. For example, the ecological leftist or neo-leftist movements and people who follow them is definitely very much against any kind of war ideology. On the other hand, you have the more privileged sections, particularly those who head the business, financial, and political circles. Those, of course, tend to be much more warlike, or at least warmongering, because they see that their own positions and their own dominance is threatened. And they fear an uprising, and therefore they feel that you should channel the growing opposition to their ideas towards an enemy. And Russia right now is a very convenient enemy because of what's happening in Ukraine and also because of the old anti-Soviet tradition in Western Europe. So you can see that society is getting very divided. And the problem is that those who want to wage war, such as Prime Minister Starmer, and even President Macron, sometimes, I mean, one day out of two, he says we should be ready for it, and then he sort of pulls back. But and even the new Chancellor Merz, the problem is that they see their society is not following them. You see, the people who are in high positions may be on their side, but they are not going to fight. And they just want to make money from manufacturing weapons or selling them. And the people who are at the grassroots level, many of them will not fight and are very much against it. And they don't understand why they should fight for Ukraine. Or in fact, they have been told that the world is a big family and nations are pretty much outdated. So the idea of fighting for the European Union means that you have to fight for some sort of consortium of bureaucrats that you don't really know, headed by somebody called Ursula von der Leyen, who is almost uniformly unpopular. And therefore, they don't know what they're doing. And then you have the new element, which is not so new, but which is growing, which is a sort of I wouldn't say neoconservative, because neoconservatism is a very American phenomenon, which has also invaded some sections of European ruling classes. But you are dealing with a new phenomenon, which is a new authoritarian, nationalistic, revivalist movement, which looks to family, tradition, religion, and they admire for that reason Putin and Russia. So they do not see Putin as an enemy, but rather as an ally and a supporter, because they feel Putin is the only person who can give an image of a leader and a country that is actually fighting or at least containing and regulating immigration and affirming its national culture and tradition. And they feel the European leaders have betrayed them. They have not done anything to prevent immigration. And as a result, they are letting their countries be flooded by people who don't belong to the culture and who are often hostile to it. You can see what's happening with a number of governments that are falling, such as the Netherlands. Government is falling because the biggest party, which is, might say, ultra-nationalist party, has said that his allies do not want to enforce rigorous anti-immigration policies. So they'll have to again vote and try to form a new government, which will probably take a couple of years. And on the other hand, you have Poland, which has just elected a nationalist president who is very Eurosceptic, who is a strong ally of Trump, although it's difficult to be an ally of Trump because you don't know what he's going to do from one day to the next, and who is pro-NATO, but then again, he doesn't like the way NATO is being run. And although he definitely doesn't like Russia, he still, in a way, ideologically is closer to Putin than to, say, Ursula von der Leyen or Macron. So you can see the deep divisions in Europe. And in that condition, one doesn't see how this kind of loose coalition would fight anybody. You know, it reminds you of all those coalitions that were assembled against Napoleon and that lost until the last one managed to win, you know, after Russia had effectively defeated the French. So we have the same situation here, that Russia is defeating the West. And as a result, the West is splintering up with a number of countries such as Hungary, Slovakia, now to an extent Poland, and not to mention Austria and Italy. They are all saying, well, why should we follow orders from Brussels or even from Washington? You know, we can make our own deals. And that means effectively the end of the European Union. Maybe I'm being I'm anticipating here, but recently I was listening to that very good talk given by the leading French anthropologist and sociologist Emmanuel Todd. He was invited to speak at the Russian Lomonosov State University, and he gave a very interesting outline of his book, his latest book, where he essentially predicts that the West is waning. It's called How the West Lost. And he says that the destruction of social and family structures in the West has led to a growing emptiness, which has threatened the very foundations of Western civilization. And he says that Trump has been trying in a very awkward and rather brutal way to reverse that. But he's doing it in such a ham-handed manner that it's not clear that he will succeed. In fact, it doesn't look like he will succeed, although he might achieve some of his aims in the medium term. But in the long term, the situation is much harder to predict. And therefore, Emmanuel Todd sees the victory of Russia in Ukraine as a prelude to revolution in Europe. He says that, you know, whenever a country or a group of countries has been seriously defeated, generally the system breaks down, there is a revolution later, just like the Bolshevik Revolution came after the defeat of Russia in World War I. And he says in the same way that the loss by France, for example, of its traditional African sphere of influence is also creating a massive social and economic and political crisis in France, together with the other problems. And as a result, he expects a number of regimes to fall and some new, rather unpredictable forms of political organization to emerge. Now, will that be an attempt to reconcile the various factions, including the Muslims, who are now a very important factor in European politics, or will it be a radical break, which will in turn possibly trigger a civil war? America has the same problem. Will the excesses of MAGA catalyze the opposition of the immigrants and a lot of the liberal and the minority classes, which could also lead to a splintering of the US society? And of course, it all begins with the family, because as Emmanuel Todd analyzes very rigorously on the basis of studies that he did over the history of society for the last few hundred years, he shows that when you have a breakdown of the family, people get disoriented, and religion is also gradually demolished or wiped out. And as a result, people have no longer are not rooted in any community beliefs, so they create new ones. And this could be based on race, on a concept of violence for conquering power, or on all sorts of ideologies. And you don't know what will turn out in the end. What will be who will be the last man standing?
You say again and again, Kuhn, that the Russia will defeat the West, so to speak, and of course, many people I know, of course, also believe that, especially as the war has dragged on and on. But has this latest drone attack, the so-called spider web attack that Ukraine made on some very critical Russian, air assets, has that convinced you that some of that tide may have turned?
No. And the reason is that after talking to strategists on both sides, Russia as well as the West, it doesn't appear to be anything that would challenge the Russian success to any measurable extent, simply because it's an attack on certain facilities which had kept assets such as strategic bombers on the open ground, because these are mandated by the international agreements between Russia and the US. The bombers cannot be hidden. Even in Diego Garcia, they're lying on the tarmac. The reason being that you have to be able to predict through the satellite surveillance system whether or not these bombers are about to take off and where. So if that, of course, changes, then you can hide them into bunkers. And that's probably what Russia will do now. So that is an additional blow to the mutual deterrence system, which could then lead to complete ignorance on both sides of what the other one is preparing. And that's exactly, by the way, what Zelensky and his backer was trying to achieve. That's why Trump was probably sincerely angry, because it would defeat his purpose of showing that he can bring about détente. On the contrary, now he might have to deal with a much more secretive Russia about its new weapon systems. And as a result of that, Russia has been given almost a blank check to wipe out whatever is left of Ukraine. And as you know, the Russians do not back down because they suffer some damage. They generally get even harder. And as a matter of fact, now it turns out that even the Ukrainian defense staff has conceded that the number of bombers that were hurt or destroyed is much lower than what they originally announced. Of course, Zelensky was making a PR announcement, but in fact, when he said that, they were talking about 30% of all the bombers being destroyed, now it boils down to about 10%. And some of them may be even repairable. They are only temporarily prevented from flying. So given the scale of the Ukrainian war and the scale on the size of the Russian strategic defense system, this is fairly negligible. I mean, Russia doesn't need hundreds of bombers to carry out some major attack if it wants to use them for either strategic or even nuclear strikes. So in the end, what Ukraine achieved was a big PR thing, which is what they have been trying to do forever, that saying that, you don't look at the numbers and at the fact that we are losing ground every day, just look at how we can hurt Russia here or there, which basically means we no longer have many soldiers, so we are using drones. And that is, of course, the future of warfare. where eventually you won't need many people, but all civilians will be hit by all sorts of things coming from the sky and from other places.
Well, Kung, this is a very dire picture that you paint, and no doubt we'll have other opportunities to discuss this in detail with you as we go forward. But for now, thank you very much for giving us a real insight about what's happening in the European mind at the moment, especially after these attacks in Ukraine, and of course the riots we saw in Paris. Thanks very much for your time.
Most welcome. Always a pleasure. Bye, Hindol.